If you just do it, it'll turn out okay. However, it didn't turn out okay, really, for who we're talking about today.
Yeah, yeah, no. Uh, well, it depends on where you're looking, but yeah, it doesn't end well for the House of Wessex, at least.
Well, at least for their power, well, at least for their power, their bloodline turned out okay.
Eh, some of it, yeah.
Eventually, at least. But yep, today we are finally ending our little mini series of the Anglo Saxons.
Yep, all good things have to come to an end at some point, and Anglo-Saxon England, depending on your definition of that, ends today. But
So,
before that,
so, so
oh,
as we for that, we go to your current events thing. So you've been reading this book. Overall, what was with this? What was your opinion of this book in this series?
it's a really good book. I mean, the two authors are like some of the best in the field of Anglo-Saxon history. It's a bit dry because it's a historical work. For non-historically trained people, it might get confusing because part of writing in history is about making argumentation. So sometimes you might think that, oh, I figured this out, and then it's like, no, that's just one argument. Now I'm going to bring forth this other argument, and you're just confused again. But it's a good book for some.
Awesome. Recommend 10 out of 10. Thumbs up.
Uh, 7 out of 10, just because its accessibility is a little iffy.
Ah, sometimes the ones you want to read always are.
It more just like it might be hard for some people to follow, kind of thing.
Alright. But alright.
Yeah. I
So I
originally wasn't I originally wasn't gonna do one of these today, but while I was at work today, I got a notification that as Azerbaijan troops were conducting offensive operations, so I thought I might as well talk about it because this is a interesting, shitty situation. So this map shows the different ethnicities within Azerbaijan.
alright.
As you can see, there is a massive cluster of Armenians living in the southwest, but they're not in Armenia. This ultimately, and this area is called Karabakh. The deepest red is called Nagorno Karabakh because it's more mountain. Yeah, stuff like that. So essentially, during the Soviet Union, a council was convened to figure out who would own what in the area. And originally, the Soviet Council was going to give Nagorno Karabakh to Armenia because it's majority Armenian. But Stalin decided to say, no, I'm giving it to Azerbaijan. And this was probably done to destabilize the area, make it so that independence movements couldn't spring up. Uh, this leads to the problems of today. And as soon as the Soviet Union's breaking up, in the next slide you'll see there is a war over this area. Essentially, the Armenians in Nagorno Karabakh declare independence. Uh, the war had been brewing for 3 years at this point, but in 1991, the Soviet Union, of course, collapses. I'm very sorry about that. I told them to be quiet, but they're not being quiet. Um, The Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh declare independence as the Republic of Artsakh. And essentially, a war breaks out called the First Nagorno-Karabakh War. The Armenians are involved in it. There's a lot of ethnic cleansing on both sides, which is not good, of course. The Armenians win this, though, and the Orange area eventually becomes controlled essentially by the Armenians. And in 1994, the war ends. Russia brokers the peace. Russia and Armenia are allied. Azerbaijan and Turkey are allied. And originally, Georgia was, facilitating Russia getting weapons and aid to Armenia. However, in 2008, Russia decides to invade Georgia. And this will become important in 2020 because Georgia refuses to let the Russians send military aid through their territory, essentially ensuring that Armenia is isolated and by itself. So in 2020, if you go to the next slide,
Okay.
while everybody is talking about the pandemic and the election and everything, Azerbaijan and Armenia go to war in the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, and this is an absolute disaster for Armenia. It loses most of the territory it controlled. Artsakh and Armenia are nearly cut off from each other, except for this small little area called the Lakin Corridor. I don't know how to say it. But the Russian and Georgia, of course, pissed off about 2008, doesn't let the Russians send support to Armenia. There's ethnic cleansing, but this time because the Armenians aren't winning, it's mostly against Armenian civilians in Nagorno-Karabakh, which isn't good.
Ethnic cleansing usually isn't.
Yeah, it usually isn't. The Russians end up creating a ceasefire in which they become peacekeepers in the Lakin Corridor, ensuring that Armenia can help get food and stuff and essential goods into Nagorno-Karabakh. Of course, in 2022, Russia decides to do a thing in Ukraine that causes a lot of troops to not be in the area, and Azerbaijan starts essentially flouting the ceasefire. In September, there was artillery shelling and some fighting occurring between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And for the last 2 months, it might be longer than that, I can't quite remember, Azerbaijan has essentially blockaded Nagorno-Karabakh, ensuring that they don't get food, they don't get medicine, they don't get anything. They've even blocked off the road in the Lakin Corridor. From what I could tell, the Armenians were using some dirt roads to get food into Nagorno-Karabakh, and this was being facilitated by the Russians. However, Azerbaijan is saying that instead of food or other medical equipment and stuff, the Armenians were smuggling weapons into Nagorno-Karabakh and have now used this as a justification to assault positions in the area and now block off this road. They're essentially trying to ensure that Nagorno-Karabakh surrenders, and that's not a good thing because these two countries don't have a good history when it comes to whenever they take control of territory with the other ethnicity living inside it. So yeah, this isn't good. I heard something about the Russians put peacekeepers pushing that Azerbaijan forces back. I don't know about that. So yeah, this is a developing situation, and it's a bad one, and most people don't talk about it because I didn't hear it. Nobody talked about the second Nagorno-Karabakh war at all.
I didn't
So
even know about it
yeah,
until today.
yeah. Uh, this area is really bad. I
Uh,
they were talk. The president of Armenia was talking like they were about, or was it prime minister? One of the leader of Armenia was essentially saying that they were about to sign a peace treaty with Azerbaijan, and then today they're fighting each other, and it's like, oh my gosh, I don't know. Uh, and yeah, not good, not good.
But
All right,
so
yeah.
how do we connect that to the what the 10th century, 11th century?
Uh, we don't. Uh, because surprisingly, none of these actors are as bad as the Azerbaijan government or the Armenian government. Yay! uh, so
So going from the war between the Armenians and the other eight name to the war between the Vikings and the Saxons.
yeah, and so I want. So in this, we're going to talk a little bit about a guy who always gets overlooked. In every history about Anglo-Saxon England, nobody ever talks about this dude except in the context of did he give the crown to Harold Godwinson or did he give the crown to William of Normandy?
I think
Nobody talked.
I think with the guy before him, the I mean the guy before him, we know who Edward the Confessor is, but
Yeah, but nobody talks about him. Nobody talks about his reign. His reign is actually pretty interesting. But and a really big prelude to what occurs later on with William, but
but
nobody talks about him.
before we get to him, though, we talked about his half brother.
Yeah, his half brother essentially lets him come back to England. He'd been in uh, Normandy for 24 years, so Edward was had a lot of
Oh,
friends in
yeah.
Normandy and stuff
Oh,
like that.
before we go on, I must clarify. His half brother on his mother's side is currently king,
Yeah,
not his half brother on his father's side who was king. Because it's all the
yeah,
family
yeah,
tree
yeah,
is it's all
yeah.
confusing.
Harda was his name. His reign isn't really that important. Uh, as you can see in this map down here, you have two families entrenching themselves into politics. The family of Leofric of Mercia and the family of Godwin of Wessex.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I don't have it. I don't know if we talked about last time or it happens yet, but I think it was. I think it was either. It was. I think it was probably during his father's reign that Edward the Confessor's half brother got his eye, not full brother, got his eyes poked out by Godwinson daddy. Right? Is that the rumor
I don't.
goes?
Yeah, I don't remember that happening, but
Really? I heard. There's this thing. I don't know if it's just a rumor or not, or a folk tale where I forget whose reign it was in. Edward the Confessor and his full brother, him went up there, and Harold Godwinson's dad, the current Earl of Wessex, uh, poked like his eyes out so he couldn't be king.
Maybe I don't know.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know what uh
Hmm.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Uh, maybe just a rumor, then not true. Then
Yeah. How did the Canute never had any heirs? So essentially, he brought Edward the Confessor back to England to become his heir. The year before he dies. And Edward's returning to this kingdom, bringing his Norman friends with him, and he didn't speak. He spoke a lot of French with his Norman buddies, and so he's not very English. And the kingdom is divided between these two great families, and they'll become very important in Edward's reign. Um, they each have competing interests. Leofric's family is more allied with the Welsh. Godwin is more allied with Denmark and married in. He actually married into the Danish royal family, and that comes up later. But Harthacnut dies in 1042, and we have a restoration of the House of Wessex. So next slide.
yeah, I guess the only thing that's important for Harthacnut for the future is his mother's family was Norman.
Yeah, so was Edward's, but yeah.
Oh, duh.
So Edward becomes king after Harthacnut dies, bringing back the House of Wessex. Uh, he essentially has to accommodate this new aristocracy, and he does so by allying himself mostly with Godwin. He marries Godwin's daughter, Edith, in 1045. He gives a lot. He he gave a lot of earldoms to Godwin and his sons. Um, he ultimately gained some popularity by disbanding the fleet, but he also brought in a lot of these Normans to important positions, especially on the border regions with Wales, becoming marcher lords. And this will ultimately come to bite Edward in the ass. And this is why I kind of say that he's a prelude to the Norman conquest, because he brings in all these Normans with him because he
Yeah,
spent so much time.
and there's
Uh,
I don't know, and he didn't. I don't know if it's true or not, but I don't think that he didn't. He married that his that daughter-in-law or something for convenience sake, not because he actually loved her.
yeah, he later tries to force her into becoming a nun, but that's later. Uh, Early on, he's dealing with a lot of problems with Godwin. Godwin has a son named Svein Godwinson who's doing a bunch of crazy shit. He abducts the abbess of Leominster, and later on, uh, he does even more crazy. He murders someone. I can't.
And is
Can I
that
write it
the
down?
is that the one that later did something in 1066 too?
No, that's Toasty. But
The other brother.
yeah, he has a lot of sons. He was, yeah. Uh, Damn, I should have put that in. Essentially, so Svein does that, and then Godwin, who is allied to the Danish throne, early on wants to help the King of Denmark, Svein Estridsson, against who's going to become important.
Right. Hello. I think his mic died, or my headphones died. I can hear you again.
So uh so sorry, someone was trying to call me. I think that's what happened. Um
Okay.
Edward so Spain so Harald Hardrada was a Varangian guard, and he gained a lot of fame in the service of the Byzantine Empire, and he eventually becomes king of Norway, and now he moves to conquer Denmark. Um, so he invades Denmark, and Godwin wants Edward to support the king of Denmark, but Edward doesn't want to do it. So Harald Hardrada eventually conquers Denmark. Godwin loses a big ally in this, and this will hurt his relationship with Edward. Godwin now starts looking for allies in Flanders, um, but the continual appointment of Norman Normans, especially to clerical positions, will eventually lead to a falling out between the two in 1051, which is the next slide.
All right, 1 second. All right.
So, Edward appoints a Norman as the Archbishop of Canterbury, essentially the biggest church person in the land. Godwin doesn't like this, and eventually there's a backlash. Godwin wants all the Normans out, but Godwin is forced to flee with his Harold Godwinson, who is very important, flees to Ireland, and Godwin flees to Flanders. This is when Edward's like, I don't like this Edith bitch. I'm going to put her in a nunnery. I'm going to make her a nun. And this is really when this is the only time where Edward actually gets to reign like he wants to. And he accelerates the Norman appointments. This now alienates Leofric's family and the others because they don't like losing power. Of course, nobody.
People like losing power. Is that a new thing or an old thing? No, people don't like that anymore.
This tapestry right here, I think it's a tapestry. I don't know, depicts Godwin and Harold's return to England in 1052. And they force Edward into peace. Most of the Normans were forced out of power, and Godwin and his family now came to control 80% of England. This is when Northumbria comes under the control of one of Godwin's sons named Tosti. You might know him as Tostig, but that's not how you pronounce his name. It's Tosti. Because Old English is funky that way.
This is English before we got a little French influence.
Surprisingly enough, French doesn't actually influence English very much phonologically. Maybe more with spelling and stuff.
Yeah.
Some words.
And also, I linked links I found in the private chat. If you want to check them out, either now or in the future, about Edward the Confessor's brother that got blinded by Godwinson.
Oh, Alfred Atheling? Yeah. Yeah, I'm not surprised by that because Godwin was a power hungry guy. Um,
And
so
that's and like I said, that's probably why he hated them. Like, oh, you bonded my brother, and I listened to what you're saying. Yeah. I'm friends with you for sure.
yeah, they were more allies out of political convenience, but Edward still kind of chafed under that. He didn't really enjoy. He wanted more of his Norman buddies, and that eventually led to this big spat. But Godwin doesn't survive much longer. He dies in 1053. And in the next slide, we're going to get the rise of his eldest son, Harold Godwinson. So, because Edith and Edward don't like each other, they were really bad at doing the kingly duty of having a son. So, there's no real heir. Edward invites one of, I think, his nephew, right? Yeah, his nephew Edward the Exile, who had been exiled to Hungary.
The Iron, I think Edmund Ironside's kid from his
Yeah,
dad's side.
yeah. In 1057, he invites them back, but Edward the Exile dies essentially as soon as he returns to England,
Yeah.
which isn't good. He does have a son named Edgar Atheling, but most people don't really care about him. Atheling, by the way, means crown prince.
I was going to say, but people do care about his daughter, who might have married into the Scottish family.
Yes. Yes, but Edgar Atheling, I think that was actually his sister. But yeah. Edgar Atheling, essentially nobody cares about him. And Harold Godwinson now, so Harold, Leofwine, and Gurth on the map. These are three of Godwin's kids. The other one isn't on the map because this shows after he fell from power. You've got Tosti, who controlled Northumbria, but the Northumbrian Thanes didn't like him. They saw him kind of tyrannic as a tyrant. So that happens. But Harold decides to ally himself with the grandsons of Leofric, Edwin and Morcar. You can see them on the map as well. He allies with them to essentially shore up his chances to become king. And then in 1064, Harold travels to Normandy. During that whole debacle between Godwin and Edward, if Edward ever promised the throne to William the Conqueror, that is when it happened. And it's disputed on if that actually happened. Some people try to say that the events in 1064 where Harold Godwinson travels to Normandy support that. William had been nominated the heir by Edward. But it's also possible that Harold Godwinson had relatives who were held hostage by Normandy, and he's trying to ransom them back.
Right. Of course, again, of course, at this time, his last name wasn't Conqueror, but I think people called him Bastard.
Yeah, William the Bastard, because he was a bastard. Yeah. Harold, when he arrives in Normandy, however, was captured by the Count of Ponthieu, but he was rescued by William. And Harold, during this time, swears an oath to William. We don't really know what this means. The Normans later on say that it was Harold invalidating Harold's claim to the throne and giving it to William. as a propaganda thing. It could have just been like, we're buddies now kind of thing. And Harold heads back to England. And in 1065, a revolt happens against Tosti, who was seen as overstepping his powers by the Northumbrian nobility. Edward the Confessor actually wanted to go and fight the rebels and help Tosti. Harold, however, says no. This shows that he has an immense power because he's telling the king what the king can and can't do. And he also kind of backstabs his brother here, which is important for later. Tosti is essentially forced out of power by the Northumbrians, and one of Leofric's grandsons, Morcar, becomes the Earl of Northumbria. So every single earl is now allied with Harold Godwinson.
Cool. And it's funny though, not like funny that, or ironic maybe, not funny, but the power base of the Godwinsons is where the current Anglo Saxon king's power originally came from, the Wessex.
Yeah, that is true. Their power originates from being earls of Wessex. Now, technically, earldoms were not hereditary, but in practice, they were. And they were given royal estates for as long as they were the earl. It wasn't theirs, but in practice, it wasn't like that. So that's why they're able to gain so much power.
Well, technically, I think that at this time, the kingdom wasn't hereditary. What was it called? The council something?
The Witena Yemot.
What?
The Witena Yemot
gave him the power, kind of. I heard.
Yeah, they usually elected the monarch, but
even though it was usually hereditary election, but
yeah, stuff like that. It is suggested by some that not being allowed to go after the rebels caused immense stress to Edward the Confessor that would lead to his death soon after in 1066, which is in the next slide. Because this is a very, very, very important year. Edward dies with no heir in January of 1066. Technically, there's... What?
I was going to say, wow, you mean not having sex with the woman you don't like made you have no heir? That's weird.
Yeah. There was Edgar Atheling, of course, but nobody cared about him. And Harold was the one...
Well, because he was blind anyway, so... No.
Edgar wasn't blind, no.
Oh, sorry, I meant Alfred. Edward's half-brother.
But Harold had most of the support. Essentially, all of the earls were on his side. And he had immense military and political power. So he quickly coronates himself as king. Now, William says that he's supposed to be king because he was promised in 1052 by Edward, according to him, that now he was king.
Yeah.
And he also... What?
Yeah, I can say, you're going to say it like, he's like, I'm supposed to be king. Hey, Mr. Pope, you know, this guy made a promise, he broke it, so I'm king, right? And Pope's like, yeah, sure, whatever.
Yeah, the Pope supports William's claim to the throne. William also cites 1064 as Harold essentially saying that he wasn't allowed to become king anymore. But Harold says that on Edward's deathbed, he said that Harold was supposed to become king. It wasn't, of course, Edward's choice. But
I say, don't you just love Yeah, he totally said it before he died. I was a witness. He told me to be king. You can trust
yeah,
me.
yeah, yeah. So these are the two strongest claims to the throne, and the Pope ends up backing William of Normandy. So essentially, a bunch of people in France now flock to the Norman side to
And,
head across the
and
head across the channel.
I say, but first, meanwhile, we had a little problem with Harold's brother up north.
Yeah, so Harold was actually on the south coast with the army, waiting for William to come, but the winds weren't favorable, and William wasn't able to cross the channel. So on the 8th of September of 1066, Harold disbands the army. When suddenly up north, uh, Toasty is getting picked up in Scotland by a dude from earlier, Harold Hardrada, who has the weakest claim to the throne, but he's like, let's try it anyway.
Because sometimes,
And he,
sometimes it's not the claim; it's the army. It's the army behind the claim.
yeah, exactly. That's how it kind of was with Harold as well. But they got their schemes, they've got their justifications. Harold Hardrada is just like an old school Viking, and he's like, yeah, let's conquer this bitch. And 8 days after Harold disbands the army, here is Harold Hardrada in Northumbria. Harold now has to rapidly bring his forces back together and march quickly up into Northumbria. Edwin and Morcar, the grandsons of Leofric, they have a force up in Northumbria that meets Harold Hardrada at Fulford on the 20th of September, but the army is absolutely massacred. This isn't a good start for the English, but only 4 days after the Battle of Fulford, in immense, amazing speed, Harold reaches the area, and the next day, he squares off with Harold Hardrada and his brother Tosti, who decided to support Harold Hardrada. Not because he was bitter. Don't you say it was because he was better. Okay, it was because he was bitter. And the Battle of Stamford Bridge happens, and the Norse are absolutely the treatment they gave to the English at Fulford, they now got back from the English at Stamford Bridge.
Awesome.
Barely any ships were able to escape. Harold Hardrada, a man who had fought all across the Mediterranean, dies. Toasty also dies. And
then, as I said, and then meanwhile, while he was up north, the winds down south suddenly changed.
yes, and now because the fleet, Harold's fleet and his army is up north, the next day, the 26th of September, without fear of being harassed at all, William now crosses the channel at night and is like, oh shit. Now I have to go all the way back down there? Oh. If only my dad was able to convince Edward to stop Harold Hardrada from taking Denmark. Ugh. That's probably what he's thinking right now. Like, oh my gosh. Because there's a good chance that if he didn't have to go up north, he might have been able to defeat William.
Yeah, or maybe he might without even, or maybe if my brothers were such pricks.
Yeah, that too. To be fair, he was kind of a prick to his brother. His brother's getting revolted against him. He's like, no, don't act. This is to my advantage. So Now Harold has to march all the way back down. And on the 14th of October, this is all happening really quick, by the way. This is insane. Harold has marched up and down in only a matter of like a month.
And
That's insane.
this is the time before cars, so traveling even across a small country called let's say England took a while.
Yeah. They're moving 100 times faster than the Russian army in Ukraine. Insane. Little dig at Russia. I'm sorry. So a battle occurs. Essentially, the Anglo Saxons, who are renowned infantry, they're in a shield wall. They're up on the hill, and William of Normandy with his Normans, who are mostly cavalry based, they have to charge uphill. And they constantly charge uphill with horses, but horses don't like going after people with sticks pointed at them and with a lot of essentially a forest of spears. Horses won't do that. Horses will not do that. So they're constantly retreating and everything. Eventually, the English think they've won the battle. People are talking about William dying in battle. So they're like, oh, this is our chance. This is our chance to chase after the enemy, destroy them, take captives, get some money, will be nice. And they run after the Norman cavalry into a swamp, man. A swamp.
A swamp! Plus, they broke their defense.
Plus, they broke their renowned defense. And now, all of a sudden, the cavalry turns back, smashes into the English. Their excellent defense against the bows that are being shot at them, that's gone. People are getting shot. Harold eventually gets shot in the eye. Harold's siblings die. It's bad. Harold died. The English have lost. They were doing so good.
I just thought of something right there. If you believe in what's it called, irony or karma and stuff, not really, but it's like it was Harold's dad that blinded the eye of the one guy, and now his son gets blinded the eye.
Yeah, but oh my gosh, they were doing so well, and then they lost discipline, and now this wasn't actually the final move in this war. A lot of people think that this is when William becomes king. No. The survivors actually flee to London, and they now make Edgar Atheling king. The guy nobody cared about is now king, supported by Edwin, Morcar, and the Archbishop of York. William moves east, actually, and starts solidifying his control of the south, and then pushes north. And it seems that the supporters of Edgar are just like, we're screwed. We're just going to surrender. And that's when William is crowned king on Christmas Day of 1066. It is said that William was being crowned as his guards were sacking and setting fire to the suburbs west of London, by the way. So...
Yeah, I heard the thing that says they were again. I know they say people were cheering for him. They thought it was a revolt, so they killed him.
Yeah, William does a lot of bad things.
Like yay, William. Like, oh, I don't understand. Are they saying yay or boo? It must be boo. Let's kill him.
So now we come into the reign of William.
The first of the Norman family tree.
So William tries to make himself out as the legitimate heir of Edward the Confessor. And this is why I put a question mark in the beginning. Does Anglo-Saxon England actually end? It depends on your definition. Now, if you mean Anglo Saxons ruling England, well, yeah, no more Anglo Saxons ever come to the throne, and technically, no family originally born in England ever comes back to the throne. The closest you get is the Tudors are from Wales. That's the closest you get. However, ultimately, most of the institutions stay in place. A lot of the English are no longer in these institutions.
Why Rockwood isn't broken?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's some changes, but ultimately, you get the Earl, the Sheriff, the Shire. These are the thing. These are the institutions that are kept in place.
Yeah.
Ultimately,
I think the only change he really does is he brings his barons down in Normandy replace the earls up in England.
originally, he doesn't even do that. He actually leaves Edwin and Morcar in power, and a lot of English landholders keep their land. Now he does levy a fine for confirmation that they hold the land, and these fines are heavy. So a lot of people end up losing all their money and having to sell their lands to Normans anyway. But still, they ultimately keep their lands at first. The family that loses most out of this are the Godwinsons. They lose all of their land, and I wonder why. Yeah, and all of their lands are redistributed to the incoming Mormons. Oh my God, Normans.
The Norman
Close,
barons.
but no. Yeah, the Mormon barons. To the Normans. But then a disturbance begins in the north. A disturbance in the force. Essentially.
And that's when he starts his castle building.
Well, he started his castle building almost immediately. Where he landed in Pevensey, he built a castle immediately. He builds a lot of castles, but a lot of it is actually castles built by the incoming Norman lords that build castles on their territory instead. And it's been said of this time that this was a big tool of colonization of England. They used these castles as a weapon, not as a defense, but as a weapon, essentially. But yeah. In 1069, Morcar and Edwin had fled the court by now, with Edgar Atheling, and the North rises up in rebellion, and William is very brutal in putting down this rebellion. Initially, the rebels actually take York, but it doesn't last, and William comes in and burns everything to the ground. It's actually William gave us a great primary source for the changes from Anglo-Saxon landholders to Norman landholders with what's called the Domesday Book, or in modern English it'd be the Doomsday Book, because you can't escape it except for if the Doomsday happens. That's why it's called that. And it records this massive devastation that there's very little estates, and the estates that are left are kind of poor up in the area because he really messes them up. And this essentially convinces him to remove almost all Englishmen from power. Now all the clergy is mostly Norman. Most of the landholders are Norman. I think by the end of this, only 5% of land will be owned by English aristocrats. Now that doesn't mean there weren't English people that supported him. There were actually English uh, thanes, which the Anglo Saxon word for knight, essentially. There were thanes that did support him and even campaigned with him in France. But most of them are now gone. But the ones who survive, they do support him, and there's only 5% of them. So
it's either get with the program or lose the rest of your power.
yeah, by 1087, only one bishop was English. So all of these important positions gone. And now we get to in 1072. He campaigns in Scotland to force Scotland to stop supporting rebels. In 1085, the King of Denmark actually was like, "I'm going to conquer England now." But then he was murdered before he could even leave. That was fun. Poor guy. William campaigned a lot in France, of course, because the French king didn't like that William now was a king, but also his vassal, but also not his vassal because he's a king.
Yeah,
very confusing.
Yeah, well, well, in the future, French and their vassals. In the future, half of France would be half of the France vassal land would be belong to the King of England in a few hundred years or so.
Yeah, France, since the beginning of the Capetians, had a big problem with their vassals having more power than them. I think, like when Hugh Capet, the founder of the Capetian dynasty, was king, the king only really held direct control over the Île-de-France, which is the area around Paris. So,
because I think he was the Count of Paris before.
Yeah, and essentially, if he ever left Paris, he was going to get captured and stuff like that. So the French monarchs were working uphill from the beginning of the Capetians to actually control their kingdom more than the dukes. And this is just another one of those examples where a powerful duke now goes off and becomes king of one of the wealthiest kingdoms at the time, which isn't good. William dies while on campaign in France. I think he was thrown from his horse, and he's fat and he's ugly because he's stupid. Yeah, he was really fat. He's the first English monarch, by the way, to be buried outside of England. So there's that.
Yeah, wasn't there a thing where they say he couldn't fit inside his old coffin or something like I forget.
Yeah, he couldn't fit inside the coffin, and they were forcing him into it, and they punctured his body. So now all of this nasty bile and so they cut his funeral short because nobody could stand the smell.
That's just funny. Like, so we build a bigger coffin now. Just stuff him in there.
Yeah. Yeah. After his death, of his 4 sons, 3 of them challenged for the throne, but only 2 at first.
Yeah.
The third.
It's weirdo. Later, the power they all got eventually, but I guess in the I don't know what it was like. Okay, I'll give my oldest son this part and my next son this part instead of giving all the one king. Like now, they did that a lot in the French and some of the families back then. Give everything to one kid. Now let's divide it up.
Well, it actually more seems like William II became king just because he so happened to be in England at the
Uh,
time, so he
okay.
was able to get the throne
And Robert
over.
was in Normandy, so he got Normandy.
Yeah, yeah. The third son played a more sneaky game
The
before he
long
becomes king.
he played the wrong
Henry.
he played the long game because eventually he got power of both.
Yeah. William Rufus took control of England. Him and his brother Robert Curthose. Um, they fought a lot, but eventually, uh, William is murdered, probably by his third brother, Henry, who becomes Henry the First in 1100. And quickly, Henry, to solidify his power, marries a Scottish princess
who,
named
who
Edith.
who happened to
But
be the grand either the granddaughter of the Edward the Exile, I think.
yep, and this was a way of increasing his legitimacy. His nobles were like, "No, don't do it. She's English. Don't do it. Her name's Edith. That's an English name." So
Change
she's
Matilda.
forced to, yeah. So she's forced to change her name to Matilda.
Yeah, she may be English, but you know, the English people might enjoy the fact that she's the bloodline of the Saxons. So legitimacy and all that stuff. Like later on our future thing, we talked about Henry VII, how he conquered England by of conquest, but he's still like, no, I'm going to marry the daughter of Edward IV, just because.
Yeah, propaganda. It's very important in legitimacy stuff like that. Um, Eventually, he triumphs over Robert in 1106 and unites the realm. And uh, Robert, I think, actually essentially sold him the duchy in order to go on
I think
crusade.
I think he actually sold it. He sold it to his brother William, but then when William died, Henry's like, "It's my debt now."
Yeah. So Henry ends the king and duke, and he's got everything. Sadly, his son dies in a freak accident. Probably not actually a freak accident. Everybody on the boat was drunk as fuck. Yeah. um. Yeah, his son dies in
But luckily or unluckily, his nephew got off the boat beforehand. Was caused a
yes,
problem later.
Stephen of Blois. Yeah. Eventually that creates a new period, but yeah, the Norman dynasty doesn't last very long. So
Yeah,
now,
but I guess I say, but again, we go into future more detail on this in the future. But I said but he marries his daughter off to another landowner in France.
yes, Geoffrey Plantagenet. So now let's talk about how much England changed and how much it didn't change. Elite discourse used to be in English, of course. Now it's in Norman French. Most of the government documents were in English, some were in Latin, but now Latin becomes the language of government. This centralized standard Old English language is no longer used, and because of that, even the parts of the Anglo Saxon chronicles that survive until the 1070s, was it the 1070s? Yeah, it was the 1070s. No? I didn't write it down. Who cares? Essentially, part of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles continues, but instead of being in this standardized Old English, it's now written in local vernacular. This centralization of languages that sort of happens in strong countries where standardized languages occur, it breaks up, and now you have multiple different dialects of English running rampant and being used even by the people like the the more elite people, when they're especially priests and stuff, as they start trying to write about the past and are writing in English. Because, funnily enough, the church lost a lot of land during the Norman conquest, and they used their connection to the English past to try to get their land back. So this is why we get histories of England later on, where we actually get focused on England before the Norman conquest, and why we don't really completely forget about it. We forget about a lot, but we don't completely forget about it in the way the English see themselves. Because the people who write histories, of course, they have a vested interest in remembering Anglo-Saxon England. I already talked about how only 5% of landowners were now English. Another thing that William did was he broke up the larger earldoms. So now, instead of Wessex, you have all of the different shires within Wessex. Instead of Mercia, you have all the different shires in Mercia. They each have their own earl.
And or did they? I have a question about that though. Is the term earl still around, or were they replaced by the term barons at this time?
Barons are smaller landholders than earls.
I was wondering if I was wondering if the barons that came up from Normandy replaced the earls of the earldom, like we're just barons now instead of earls.
So in England, the hierarchy is king, duke, earl, baron.
Okay.
That's the hierarchy.
Okay, I didn't know if like I said, I didn't know if the barons just became the earls, the new barons from the you know what I'm trying to say, the barons from Normandy became.
Yeah, but ultimately, earls, the title of earl was more ceremonial now. The people who actually held power were the sheriffs, the shire reeves. These people who are now the people who have the real power in the shires. And you start getting stories about how these sheriffs really fucking suck.
like a little future, like a little future sheriff of a certain mythology.
Yeah, Nottingham. Yeah, the sheriffs were essentially corrupt and used a lot of their power in order to help their political friends gain power in their shire, stuff like that. All of this land that had now come into the possession of William, he had to give it up to different people. And instead of putting one large landholder in a locality where they can gain power there, he instead bundles up estates where multiple different families now live in this area, so that one of them can't get too powerful, essentially ensuring that the king has more power.
Now, even to this, and this is he also did what was it called, the Doomsday Book?
Yeah, the Domesday Book.
Domesday,
and
yes.
this is how we learn a lot about who owned land, how many English landholders survived, stuff like that.
And also, I think it was him. I could be wrong though, but he instead of people pledging allegiance to their most local prominent lord, he had everyone pledge allegiance to him directly.
Yeah. Not only that, we start getting feudalism in England at this time. Essentially now, each estate had to provide military assistance to the king.
Yeah.
And of course, now that the king has obligations on the continent, you're having war a lot more. And
Yeah.
so these estates and even church estates have to figure out how they're going to give the king men. So they give out land in return for service.
Okay.
So that's
I thought about one thing. But one thing difference between the feudalism there and in France, the unlike the dukes and whatever of France that might have more similar or more power than the king of France. I guess William made sure that his feudalism subject never had much power as he did.
yeah, that's one of the benefits of gaining all this land at once so that you can give it out. You know, you make sure in one locality there's not one person that now is more rich than the others. Unlike in France, where the Capetians sort of inherited their situation, and the situation of the Carolingians had been deteriorating for a long time before that.
Yeah, were the Normans, the Anjous, and later on the whatever region that
Oh,
the Aquitors power had was more powerful than richer than the king.
Aquitaine, Anjou at the time was only a county, actually. Um, the powerful ones were Toulouse, Aquitaine. Um,
But like I said, we can go into more detail on that when
when,
if we go into
yeah,
Normans more.
yeah. Um, you actually get a loss of a lot of the local. You actually get a loss of a lot of local saints and stuff. People who had founded churches, founded abbeys, and everything. Um, this was discouraged by the Normans, and they were now forced to have cults towards more well-known saints, more universal saints. So now the English saints are repressed. Another interesting thing, a lot of French newcomers were being murdered, of course, because the English weren't very happy. But William now introduced something for if you found a French corpse in a community, uh, you could get fined with a fine called murdrum, the ancestor of murder. So this keeps them from doing that. Of course, the English language changes a bit. It's a lot of people overstate the amount that French has influenced English. English largely stays grammatically
Well,
Germanic.
I think it that it was more like the terms and stuff like what beef and stuff.
Yeah, the meat has a French name, the animal has an English name. You get loan words, but I heard someone call English a Germanic French pidgin language. No, English is still a Germanic language, and the influence of French is mostly just loan words. There's no real there's some grammatical things that happen because of it, but you can even argue that's more because of the people from Scandinavia that moved in early on that caused more of the changes
So
than French.
yeah, I mentioned this in. Well, I did mention this in our in like we talked with Dapper about uh, language evolution. That it was more of a horizontal gene transfer of influence than actual
Yeah, exactly.
evolution of English. Like a little subtle little thing.
Yeah, and this is mostly because Norman society and English society, these were separated from each other.
Yeah, like
Um,
the what was it called the high society called it this, but the dirty peasants called it this.
yeah, the English population was mostly rural, and you don't get a lot of Normans coming into this rural space. They stay on their estates. They stay in their castles, rather
Right.
than heading into this
Mingling,
rural area.
mingling with the common folk.
Yeah, and this allows English, of course, to survive and eventually become the language of the government later on. And you actually see early on that the Normans no longer called themselves just Normans. They wanted to distinguish themselves from the continental Normans, so they called themselves Anglo Normans, stuff like that. Um, because they're starting to have more of an allegiance to their new homes. A lot of the newcomers originally had names based off of localities in Normandy, but they start changing their last names to English localities
And of course,
pretty soon after.
that didn't really come into full effect until Edward III, when I think that's when it full force. I think, if I remember correctly.
Richard II was the first English king to speak to his subjects in English. So,
Okay, but
and he's
that's
the
true.
grandson. Yeah. Um, Also, we see castles changing. Castles no longer have their own English flair to them. They're rebuilt in more continental styles. Uh, so, did Anglo Saxon England end, or did it just sort of have a new coat of paint?
Paint, I'm guessing.
It's up to you. I personally think it's just a new coat of paint. It's still England. It just has new rulers.
Yeah, this it's like people that buy a donut shop or something like in my area that they didn't think about. They kept the name, they kept the bakery, they kept the type of donut they sell, but it's under new ownership.
Yeah, exactly. I, I people and you can kind of see this with Edward's reign as well. People kind of overstate how much changed. What really changed was who had power over the kingdom, and you kind of see with Edward, he was trying to bring in more Norman people, and this is because he lived in Normandy for 24 years, of course. But
Like like I said, once both Edward, Ethelred the Unready, and Canute married into the Norman family, it was all that's all she wrote.
it was all downhill from there. But yeah, ultimately, England now is more involved in continental politics, but it's still England. So this is what I wrote my college paper on. So
Your thesis for your master's or doctorate?
no, I only have a bachelor's degree, but you have to write a final paper for that too. My whole thing was about this idea that there was this sharp shift from Anglo-Saxon England to Norman England. I argued against that.
Cool. All right, so and there it ends. There's our little series on the Anglo Saxons.
Yep.
So now that the time of the bead has come to at least his time frames come to an end, how do you feel?
Are you talking to me or are you talking to the chat?
Well, you, since you are the bead.
Yes, I am. Yeah. You know, I detest the Normans. They suck. Bring back the true rulers. Screw these Norman pigs. That's how I feel. No. It's just interesting. I enjoy this period very much because it has multiple different intense societal changes, and it all comes a lot from the continent, and this constant flow of continent to the islands, and it's very interesting, and it gets less interesting as you go along, but
Yeah.
it also
I,
gets less mysterious, but that might be why.
yeah, I think around this time, if I remember the also if I remember the climate around this time, England was pretty. England was still a little, England up there was a little warm area. It wasn't the cold England we have today.
I don't know about that. I know that large portions of East Anglia were just swamp. I know
Oh,
that.
this,
So also around York there was a massive swamp, but
oh
that's
really? Because I forgot it was before that for up north for a while they even had. I think around this time they even had grapes that rivaled the grapes of France.
uh, that could that could be possible. I don't know.
Uh, yeah, I saw. I think I saw when I read a book about the cool little ice age of Europe of the 1500s.
Yeah.
Well, that's more climate history than government history, but
Yeah. But
I
yeah, it gets a lot less mysterious from here, and the mystery is sort of fun. But
yeah. I I for, a few, for we haven't talked about we talked about this a little bit. In the future, we can talk about either each of the individual families of English dynasty, like the Normans, the Plantagenets, the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Hanovers, and all of them, or we can also go in, into the individual reigns of each king, because unlike the previous Anglo Saxon ones, we probably have a lot more information now going forward now of each than we had beforehand. You can actually fill the whole episode up.
yeah. I thought it would be kind of cool to like rank monarchs of different kingdoms, or even like kingdoms that we might have lesser knowledge on, but
Like
like
a
just
like
have me sit here and rank them, and then be like,
like
this is
a
why this one's good, and this is why this one fucking sucks.
yeah. We go that. So look forward to that. But well, for the at least we did beforehand, our first tier chart on Talking Time Caffeine. From S rank to why were they starting from the highest of S rank to the bottom of why were they king again? But
There are definitely some kings there just because they happen to be kids, but
but
we're
that
good.
will be in a future date. Next, right, for next week, April the 1st, I have nothing planned for April Fool's Day episode, but who knows? Things can change. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll be going back to the entertainment industry where we talk about Tobey Maguire and his Spider-Man trilogy. But if you want to help the stream out, click scan either the donate link up there, the Amazon wish list to help upgrade the studio a little bit. So we're not running on Wi-Fi, but until until the beat is back again, never stop learning. Enjoy the randomness. We'll see you next time. Bye.